The wind on the platform had teeth, biting at the thin wool of Ilara's shawl. It was a mournful sound, the whistle of a departing train leaving behind a silence as vast and empty as the prairie stretching out from the lonely depot. Ilara clutched the single, worn valise that held the entirety of her life as a widow. A life defined not by love, but by its stark absence, and by the final, clinical pronouncement from a city doctor, a barren womb, a quiet, hollow space where hope had once tried to grow. She was returning to the emptiness she had fled, only now it was cemented inside her, an irreversible truth. It was in this moment of profound desolation that she saw them. 3 young women, huddled together on a bench like a trio of frightened sparrows cast from their nest. They were little more than girls, their faces pale with a shared fear, and beneath their simple, worn dresses, the unmistakable swell of life. All 3 of them were pregnant. They did not speak, but their hands were linked, a desperate chain against the encroaching cold. The station master paid them no mind, sweeping dust from the boards with a brusque indifference. The world, it seemed, had already decided to look away. But Ilara could not. In their wide, terrified eyes, she saw a reflection of her own helplessness, yet in the gentle curve of their bellies, she saw the one thing she had been denied. A strange, fierce instinct, one she thought long dead, stirred within her. It was not pity. It was something closer to recognition, a whisper in the soul that said, "Here is a purpose." She took a slow, deliberate breath, the frigid air stinging her lungs, and walked toward them, her own lonely journey suddenly, inexplicably, tied to theirs. The world had offered her nothing but an echo, but perhaps, just perhaps, she could offer them a shield against the wind. The eldest, who introduced herself as Faye with a voice as fragile as spun glass, did the talking. Her sisters, Clara and Iris, remained silent, their gazes fixed on the splintered floorboards as if the answers to their predicament were written there. They had fled, Faye explained, their words clipped and hushed, from a place where a father's word was law and a daughter's body was his to barter. Their fiancés, men they had never met, were waiting in a town 3 stops down the line, but a kindly conductor had seen the stark terror in their eyes and warned them of the brutal reputation of the men and the community they were being sold into. He had let them off at this desolate station with a whispered blessing and a loaf of bread, their only provision against the vast, uncaring wilderness. They had no money, no plan, only the desperate, fledgling hope of escape. Ilara listened, her own grief a distant hum against the sharp immediacy of their fear. She thought of her late husband, a man whose hands were cold even in summer, whose silence was a judgment. She understood the prison of a life chosen for you. Her own infertility had been a source of shame, a failure in his eyes, and now, looking at these 3 girls carrying the future within them, she felt not jealousy, but a fierce, almost maternal surge of protectiveness. She had so little to offer. A few dollars, a small, empty cottage that was no longer truly hers, and a heart scarred by loss. It was next to nothing, but it was more than they had. "There's a ranch," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "A few miles from here. The owner, he keeps to himself. But there's a barn. It will be warmer than this." The sisters looked at her, their shared gaze a single question. Could she be trusted? Ilara met their eyes, letting them see the quiet truth of her own sorrow. "I have nowhere else to go either," she confessed. "We will go together." The walk was a pilgrimage through a landscape of punishing beauty. The sky was a vast, bruised purple, and the wind scoured the plains, whipping their skirts and stealing their breath. The land was unforgiving, a reflection of the world that had cast them out. Thomas's ranch appeared on the horizon like a mirage, a cluster of dark buildings stark against the endless expanse. It was a place built for solitude, a fortress against intrusion. The main house was solid, made of dark timber and stone, but a portion of its roofline was jagged and black, the skeletal remains of a fire that had devoured a part of it years ago and was never repaired. It was a wound left open to the sky. As they drew closer, a man emerged from the barn, his frame broad and imposing. This was Thomas. His face was weathered, carved with lines of grief that had settled so deep they looked like part of his bones. He moved with a heavy, deliberate slowness, as if the very air around him were weighted with memory. He stopped when he saw them, 4 women appearing out of the grey twilight, 3 of them heavy with child. His expression didn't change, but his eyes, the color of a winter storm, narrowed. Ilara stepped forward, leaving the sisters huddled behind her. She did not ask for pity. "Sir," she began, her voice clear despite the wind. "My name is Ilara. These girls have nowhere to spend the night. We saw your barn. We would be willing to work for our keep. We only ask for shelter from the wind." Thomas's gaze swept over them, lingering on the gentle swell of their bellies. For a fleeting moment, a flicker of something raw and agonizing crossed his face before the mask of stoicism slammed back into place. He said nothing for a long time, the silence stretching until it was taut with tension. Then, he gave a single, curt nod toward the barn. "The loft is dry," he grunted, his voice a rough, unused thing. "There's hay." He turned without another word and disappeared back into the shadows of the barn, leaving them on the threshold of his desolate kingdom. The barn smelled of hay and earth and animals, a scent of life that felt alien in the profound stillness of the ranch. The loft was cold, but it was a shield from the relentless wind. The sisters huddled together, pulling thin blankets from their small bundles, while Ilara found a spot a little way apart, granting them the illusion of privacy. She lay awake, listening to the lonely sounds of the prairie and the quiet, rhythmic breathing of the girls. The next morning, they awoke to find a pail of fresh, still warm milk and a stack of firewood just outside the barn door. There was no sign of Thomas. It became a silent ritual. Each day, he would leave them something, a basket of eggs, a few potatoes from his root cellar, a slab of smoked bacon. He never spoke to them, never acknowledged their presence beyond these taciturn offerings. They, in turn, worked. They mended the fences near the barn, swept the stalls, and washed the milk pail until it gleamed, leaving it on the spot where they had found it. It was a conversation held without words, a currency of labor and provision. Thomas would watch from the window of his dark house, a solitary ghost in his own home. He saw the gentle way Ilara cared for the sisters, her quiet competence, her fierce protectiveness. He saw them sitting in a patch of sunlight, their hands busy mending their worn clothes, their low murmurs a sound his ranch had not heard in 5 years. 5 years since the fire. 5 years since the laughter of his wife, Anna, and the boisterous shouts of his son, Leo, had been silenced forever, replaced by the crackle of flames and a grief so vast it had consumed his world. These women, these vessels of new life, were a painful reminder of everything he had lost, yet their presence was also a tiny, persistent crack in the wall of ice he had built around his heart. He would chop more wood than necessary, stacking it high against the barn, a bulwark against the cold, a silent admission that he had, against his will, accepted their presence. The sky, which had been clear for days, turned a malevolent shade of grey. The wind rose to a howl, and a freezing rain began to fall, turning the hard ground to a slick, treacherous mud. The storm descended upon the plains with a biblical fury, rattling the old timbers of the barn. Inside, the cold was a living thing. Rain found its way through tiny cracks in the roof, dripping onto the hay with a maddening persistence. The sisters shivered, wrapping themselves in every scrap of cloth they possessed, their faces pinched with cold and misery. Ilara did her best to keep their spirits up, but the damp chill was seeping into their bones. Through the sheets of rain, she could see a single lamp burning in the window of Thomas's house, a lone beacon of warmth in the maelstrom. She imagined the heat from a stone fireplace, the simple comfort of a solid roof. She would not ask for more. They had been given the barn, and it was his right to keep his home, and his grief, to himself. Hours passed. The storm only intensified. Suddenly, the great barn door creaked open, thrown back by a gust of wind. Thomas stood there, silhouetted against the tumultuous sky, rain plastering his dark hair to his forehead. He held a lantern aloft, its golden light cutting through the gloom. He didn't speak. He simply looked at them, at the 3 pregnant girls huddled together for warmth, at Ilara standing protectively before them. His gaze was unreadable, but the rigid line of his jaw seemed to soften. He lifted the lantern and jerked his head toward the house. It was not an invitation, it was a command, an undeniable gesture that spoke louder than any words. Without a sound, Ilara roused the sisters, and they followed him through the driving rain, leaving the cold, leaking barn for the profound, intimidating silence of his home. The house was a shrine to a life that had ended abruptly. Dust motes danced in the lantern light, coating furniture that hadn't been moved in years. In the main room, a stone fireplace stood cold and black, and on the mantelpiece, a single framed photograph was turned to face the wall. One door, leading off the main room, was closed. Elara knew, instinctively, that this was the room that held the heart of his pain, the untouched space where his wife and son had lived. She would not pry. Thomas gestured to the spare rooms upstairs, their furnishings simple but clean beneath the layer of disuse. Here was all he said, before retreating back into the shadows of his own home, becoming a silent, brooding presence in the chair by the cold hearth. A new routine began, one of proximity and shared silence. While the sisters rested, Elara began to reclaim the house from its neglect. She did not touch the closed door or the photograph on the mantel, but she swept the floors, dusted the furniture, and washed the grime from the windows, letting in the pale winter light. She found the kitchen, a space of quiet order, and began to cook, filling the silent house with the scent of simmering soup and baking bread. She was repaying a debt, but it was more than that. She was tending to the space, breathing a quiet life back into it. As she worked, she was haunted by her own past. She remembered her husband's sterile, immaculate house, where a misplaced book was a transgression. She remembered the devastating quiet after the doctor's words, the finality of her barrenness. Her husband had not been cruel, merely distant, as if her inability to bear a child had made her a stranger to him. His death had left her not with grief, but with a profound and echoing loneliness. Now, surrounded by the promise of new life, she felt a bittersweet ache. She would never feel a child stir within her, but she could protect these children. She could mother these girls. In this house of sorrow, tending to these future lives, Elara began to find a purpose that was wholly her own. One evening, as a fragile peace settled over the house, a sharp cry came from upstairs. It was Faye. Elara rushed to her room to find the girl pale and doubled over, her hands clutching her stomach. A wave of panic washed over the small room. Clara and Iris hovered helplessly, their own fears reflected in their sister's pain. Elara, however, felt a strange calm descend. She remembered the things her own mother had taught her, the old-world knowledge passed down through generations. She spoke in a low, soothing voice, coaching Faye through her breathing, pressing a cool cloth to her forehead. The cramps were sharp but irregular, a false alarm, a sign of the body preparing itself. Downstairs, Thomas had risen from his chair, frozen by the sound of pain from above. It was a sound he knew too well, a prelude to a loss he could never forget. He stood at the bottom of the stairs, his hands clenched into fists, warring with the instinct to flee and the urge to help. After what felt like an eternity, the cry subsided. Elara emerged from the room, her face tired but calm. She saw Thomas standing there, his face a mask of raw anguish. "She's all right," Elara said softly. "The babe is just restless." He didn't respond, but his gaze fell upon her with a new intensity. He saw not a helpless refugee, but a woman of quiet, formidable strength. He saw the competence in her hands and the deep, unwavering compassion in her eyes. The next evening, a new sound filled the house. The rhythmic rasp of a saw coming from the barn. Elara looked out the window to see the glow of Thomas's lantern. He was working, his broad back bent over a piece of pine. He was not mending a fence or chopping firewood. He was building something. A small, simple cradle. And the next night, he began another. And then a third. The quiet, steady work was his answer, his promise. It was the first act of creation the ranch had seen in 5 years. The peace was shattered by the arrival of a rider. He was a tall, gaunt man on a tired-looking horse, his face as severe and unforgiving as the winter landscape. He dismounted with a stiff, proprietary air, his eyes scanning the ranch as if it were his own. The sisters, who had been sitting on the porch enjoying a rare moment of winter sun, froze. The color drained from their faces. "Father," Faye whispered, the word a curse. It was Silas. He did not acknowledge his daughters. His cold, assessing gaze landed on Elara, dismissing her instantly, before fixing on the house. "I've come for my property," he announced, his voice flat and hard. The ingrates who ran from their duty. Thomas emerged from the house, drawn by the strange voice. He moved not with haste, but with a deliberate, unnerving calm, wiping his hands on a rag. He stood on the porch, a step above the other man, his sheer size a silent statement. He didn't speak, merely waited, his stormy eyes fixed on Silas. "These are my daughters," Silas said, gesturing to the terrified girls with a contemptuous flick of his wrist. "They belong to me. They will be returning with me to honor the arrangements I have made." He took a step toward the porch, his hand reaching for Faye's arm. The air grew thick, heavy with unspoken violence. The prairie fell silent, the wind holding its breath. Elara moved to stand slightly in front of the sisters, a fragile but defiant shield. This was the cruelty they had fled. This was the world that saw women as chattel, children as assets. And in the center of it all stood Thomas, a mountain of quiet fury, a guardian who had been woken from a long, sorrowful sleep. "They're not going with you." The words were low, a rumble from deep in Thomas's chest. They were not a request or a negotiation. They were a fact, as solid and immovable as the stone foundation of his house. Silas stopped, his hand hovering in the air. He turned his full attention to Thomas, a flicker of disbelief in his cold eyes. "This is a family matter," he sneered. "It does not concern you." Thomas took one slow step forward, so he stood at the very edge of the porch, looming over the other man. "They are under my protection," he stated, his voice dropping even lower, laced with a threat as sharp as broken glass. "This is my land. And they are in my home. That makes it my concern." For the first time, Silas seemed to see Thomas for what he was, not just a reclusive rancher, but a man who had nothing left to lose and had just found something worth defending. He saw the raw, untamed grief in the man's eyes, and he recognized that it had been forged into something harder, something unbreakable. Silas hesitated, his bluster faltering. He looked from Thomas's unyielding face to the terrified but resolute women behind him. He looked at Elara, who met his gaze without flinching. He was one man against a fortress, not of wood and stone, but of will. He saw that there was no bargain to be made here, no intimidation that would work. To press the issue would be to invite a violence he was not prepared to face. With a final, venomous glare, Silas spat on the ground. "You'll regret this," he hissed, the words empty and powerless. He turned, mounted his horse, and rode away, a defeated figure shrinking against the vast horizon. He did not look back. Thomas remained standing on the porch, a silent sentinel, until the rider was nothing more than a speck in the distance. Only then did the tension in his shoulders finally release. The silent Silas left behind was different. It was not empty or lonely, it was peaceful, filled with the deep, collective breath of relief. The threat had passed. They were safe. Elara looked at Thomas, her heart swelling with a gratitude so immense it left no room for words. He had stood for them. He had shielded them with his own body, his own quiet strength. He had declared them his to protect. He finally turned from the horizon, his gaze meeting hers. The storm in his eyes had calmed, leaving a profound, weary stillness. "Thank you," Elara whispered, her voice trembling slightly. He simply gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. But in that moment, 1,000 silent conversations passed between them. He turned and went back into the house, but he left the door open, an invitation. A few weeks later, in the deep quiet of the night, Faye's true labor began. This time, Elara was not alone. Thomas was there, his large, calloused hands surprisingly gentle as he brought hot water and clean linens. He stood vigil outside the door, his presence a steady comfort. As the first cry of a newborn baby echoed through the house, it was not a sound of pain, but of triumphant, defiant life. It was a sound that did not open old wounds, but began to heal them. Spring arrived, and with it, 2 more babies. The silent, grieving house was now filled with the chaotic, beautiful music of a young family. Thomas, the stoic recluse, could often be found sitting by the fire, one of the tiny babies sleeping peacefully on his broad chest. He even turned the photograph on the mantelpiece around. It showed a smiling woman and a young boy with his father's eyes. He was not erasing the past, but allowing it to live alongside the present. One afternoon, Ilara found him by the burnt section of the house, staring at the charred timbers. "I think it's time to rebuild," he said, more to himself than to her. He looked at her, and for the first time, a small, gentle smile touched his lips. It was a promise of a future built together from the ashes of their separate sorrows. And so, a lonely, infertile widow and a grief-stricken rancher, brought together by three desperate, pregnant girls, found that family is not always the one you are born into, but the one you build. It is the one you fight for, the one you protect. They learned that even the most barren ground can blossom when watered with kindness, and the most broken heart can be rebuilt, stronger than before, to make a home for love. We hope you were inspired by their story of courage and unexpected love. Remember that the greatest acts of protection often come not from grand gestures, but from the quiet, unwavering commitment to stand for those who need you most. If their journey touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and share this story with someone who needs a reminder that new beginnings are always possible.